I will start off by defining what birthright citizenship is. So anyone born in the United States is automatically um, a citizen, regardless of the parents' birthplace. The Supreme Court case that contributed to the birthright citizenship was the United States versus Wong Kim Ark Supreme Court case. So Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco to parents who were Chinese citizens. When he was returning from his trip from China, he was denied re-entry from the re-entry to the United States. So one of the factors that led to this was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that banned Chinese immigrants from entering the United States. Not only that, but it made it impossible for Chinese who were already in the United States to become citizens and naturalized citizens. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor in March 28, 1898, and I quote this, the 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction therefore are citizens of the United States and of the states where they reside. So there's three parts to this, the citizenship clause and the dual process clause and the equal protection clause. The dual process clause and equal protection are important, but I'll be talking about the citizenship clause, which gives individuals who are born in the United States the right to citizenship. So the significance is that Wong Kim Ark laid the foundation for birthright citizenship, and it raises the question, is citizenship a birthright? Second generations were able to secure the birthright citizenship in the United States due to this court case. He not only challenged the Supreme Court case during like an exclusion era for the Chinese, but he helped pave the way for all birthright citizens. And as you can see, like future generations bear fruit from this. And then the 14th Amendment acknowledges all who are born in the United States are citizens after the court case. And then in conclusion, although there was like a blockage to birthright citizenship, Wong Kim Ark paved the way for second generation and future generation. And then I would just like to leave with these two questions. How do developing countries track who is a citizen and who's not? And do you know any countries that don't have birthright citizenship?
I know in the Philippines, we don't have birthright citizenship. For example, Tim Tebow was born in the Philippines, but he doesn't have
Good example.
Filipino citizenship because his parents were U.S. citizens. So you gotta have at least one parent who's a Filipino citizen to acquire Filipino citizenship.
What would have happened if one of Tebow's parents was a Filipino citizen? He would have been he would have been a Filipino citizen too, right?
Yeah, he can claim that. Also, it would help him, like, if he's, like, trying to, for example, like, if he buys, like, a resort in the Philippines.
Resort.
Yeah, it would help him with, like, property and income tax because he's a citizen, so it's going to be lower than, say, if he was a U.S. citizen, like buying this resort and doing business there.
So most likely, if one of his parents was a Filipino citizen, most likely he would have retained dual citizenship, both Filipino and American citizenship, until the age of 18, when he would have to make a decision. He would have to decide whether he would stay as a Filipino citizen or as an American citizen. He's obviously more than 18 years old, and he would have had to make that decision then, and he would have just one citizenship, either US or Filipino. So it pays to have a Filipino citizenship if you want to buy a resort. Is that right?
I mean, I guess not right now, but well, I guess maybe because it's cheap now, and then once everything is back open, then you're gonna get so many more profits.
I guess you gotta have a lot of money too. That wouldn't hurt either, right? Yeah, that's an interesting point. Okay, how do developing countries track citizenship? That was the first question, right?
I can answer to that. So like I was born in Myanmar. It's called in a state called Chin State in Southeast Asia. Um, and I lived in a very like rural area,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like actually no way to track who was born and who was not.
Mm-hmm.
In right now in Myanmar, there's a crisis with the Rohingyas and just other ethnic groups
Yeah.
who have like kind of like identity crisis and like this birthright citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, it's just like kind of hard to track who it is in like a very developing country, and
Mm-hmm.
also in places that are not developed. I personally is not registered as a citizen in Myanmar just
Mm-hmm.
because. So like we had a village chief. He was supposed to kind of was supposed to grant us citizenship and say that we were born, because a lot of people who are born there's no hospitals, so there's no birth certificates. So
Mm-hmm.
like it's more like a witness thing,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no way to track it, and
Hmm.
it's really hard for actually ethnic groups to get citizenship from my perspective in Myanmar
Mm-hmm.
because of like the tension with the Burmese military and ethnic groups. So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's somewhat related to People's Sons that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Aung San Suu Kyi, right, is the leader of Myanmar.
Yeah, she's kind of the leader. She's not fully the leader. She's the leader for the NLD, basically a prime minister.
Could you tell us a little bit about her background? Because she has been in international news for many years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Aung San Suu Kyi is actually she's Burmese. She was born in Burma, and her father was like the general. His father was killed in like this one. They were fighting for democracy, and just he was assassinated because of like his beliefs and stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
Aung San Suu Kyi was studying. I don't know where it was, but it's somewhere in Europe. He was married to a British husband, and he had two British sons. So
Mm-hmm.
according to like the constitution that was amended, that the 2008 constitution, Aung San Suu Kyi was not allowed to be president because she had two foreign sons
Mm-hmm.
and a foreign husband. So yeah, and then she was under house arrest for so many years. I think it was more than 8 years. That's why she got the
Yeah.
Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
She was under house arrest for a really long time because she was like speaking out for the people, fighting for democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the criticism was that like when the Rohingya crisis happened,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't really stand with them and kind of defend it. Burmese government saying that like they had no action of like genocide or anything
Mm-hmm.
or cleansing, but like from my perspective, I really think that she doesn't have that much power just because Burmese is a really it's a nation that was ruled by military for
Yeah.
centuries, and it's in the hands of like colonization as well. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's for me it's really hard to say that Aung San Suu Kyi is not for the people.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think she has like that full power
Mm-hmm.
yet, just because it's a country. Well, we only had elections but starting 2010 2009, just
Mm-hmm.
very recently, and I think it's fairly new for, in my perspective, to say that Aung San Suu Kyi has power over this. She has like the support of the people, but it's like a country that's like run by military, and I believe like 25% of the seat, if you wanted to make a change, 25% of that seat is reserved for military only, and you have to
Yeah.
go through that in order to make a change or just to process anything in like
That's unbelievable that 25% of the elected seats
Mhm.
are reserved for the military personnel. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just unbelievable, right? And it's been an anomaly for me to really try to understand what appears to be a seeming contradiction in that Aung San was she had championed human rights and she had been jailed for so many years
Mhm.
because of her defense of human rights causes. And at the same time, you have the Muslim minority that's been decimated, and people have been raising questions as to what is going on. Is this a contradiction in her sort of character, or as you seem to claim that she really does not have real power in the country to be able to protect that minority? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, just because also Burma is not only like Rohingyas are not the only targeted group. Who's an ethnic minority there. We
Yeah.
were, and also the Karen people were targeted, the Kachin people, just all ethnic groups were targeted. So yeah, I guess it's safe to assume what you just summarized.
Mhm. So you use the term Burma and Myanmar interchangeably. It's presently Myanmar. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes, it is.
It used to be called Burma.
It's just easier to say in Burmese contact. And if you go to like, this is just a fun fact, but if you go to the what's it called, the USCIS office,
Yeah.
they actually use Burma as they don't, it's not Myanmar, it's Burma still for them.
Really?
Yeah, when I
Wow.
went to get my citizenship last year, they were like, yeah, it's still Burma, it's not Myanmar.
Oh, that's interesting because Burma, I thought, was an old name during British
It,
colonization.
yeah, it is. But I don't know, you wouldn't be able to say Vietnamese, Burmese,
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
and it's like
Yeah.
the Burmese people. I mean, you could say the Myanmar people, but yeah, a lot of people still use Burmese. And
Hmm.
when people refer to themselves, they're like,
Hmm.
I'm Burmese. Like, yeah, so.
Hmm. And you raised the second question, which is also very interesting. Countries without birthright citizenship, right?
Yes, I actually saw this one. Where is it at? I was just looking up just because I was just thinking about it, like how many countries are like have issues with
Yeah.
it. Obviously, we kind of have issues with it too, with Trump stating like targeting birthright citizenship and stuff. But
Hmm.
okay,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yes, it did.
yeah. I was just looking at this chart and it was kind of interesting. I couldn't find Myanmar on here, but yeah, I was just looking at the countries. So like, the first was like that little first tables like unconditional birthright citizen at birth, yes or no, and then over here with the big old birthright citizenship with condition, and under that subcategories, and
Hmm.
that was I was just looking at this and it was just pretty interesting,
Yeah.
and I was
It,
wondering if anyone.
are you able to identify
I,
any pattern in terms of which countries were able to?
I see
Um,
that there's like a lot of like African countries there
hmm.
and like Caribbean too.
Hmm. But you don't see, a lot of Western European countries. Japan does not allow it. Korea does not allow it. China does not allow it. So United States is one of the few countries around the world that are liberal democracies that actually confer birthright citizenship. I
Yeah.
believe Canada also allows birthright citizenship. I don't know if there's any other Western European countries, Southern European countries that confer birthright citizenship. So we represent a bit of an exception among the Western democracies. So it's a very liberal policy. I mean, I think it's a naturalization policies in the United States have been very restrictive since 1790. But since the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, by allowing anyone who is born within the US jurisdiction, they are able to become birthright citizens, which is a very liberal policy anywhere around the world, right? So we live in this kind of. Let's go back to the Wong Kim Ark case and conclude with some conversation about why that was significant. When did the Wong Kim Ark versus the United States case decided?
1898.
1898. And what are some of the significant sort of things that happened in 1890, around the time of 1898?
Around like a decade previous, the Chinese Exclusion Act had been passed too, and it would be like.
Yeah, in 1892, we would also pass the Geary Act that would extend the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So 6 years earlier, we had passed and extended the Chinese Exclusion Act with the Geary Act. So if you could imagine the social and political context of the time period, right? They were perceived as a social threat to American society. Probably one of the most disliked ethnic populations in the United States, perhaps next to African Americans, right? When in just 2 years earlier, we had passed the Plessy versus Ferguson case. that established separate but equal doctrine, right? So in terms of the social and political context, it was the worst of the time period for the Chinese in America. And yet, the US Supreme Court decided that those Chinese parents who have children in the United States, the children are still considered US citizens. I think that's pretty significant. The US Supreme Court rendered a decision regarding the second generation of Chinese Americans whose parents were regarded as socially undesirable for many, many decades. And yet, the 14th Amendment still favored the Chinese American, the second generation Chinese Americans. And there's a similar kind of debate that is happening in the contemporary time period, right? A number of states have or try to introduce their own sort of, laws to overturn the 14th Amendment. Or, there have been some statesmen, congressmen who try to amend the Constitution to strip American citizenship from children of undocumented parents, for instance. So the context is quite, similar between the 1890s and in the contemporary period. And so we have to, I think, keep in mind what was happening in the 1890s and try to understand significance of that case as it relates to the current debates on birthright citizenship today.
So for my topic, my presentation, I'm doing it on PaperSon. So before I go into what PaperSon is, I wanted to give a little bit of background history on what we've learned earlier in the semester that really influenced PaperSon. So the first one being the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It was the first federal legislation that stopped a nationality, which was the Chinese. It excluded the Chinese population from coming to the United States. It was passed by Congress and also signed by President Chester A. Arthur. Another influence on PaperSon was the Geary Act of 1892. This act extended the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years, and it also required Chinese people living in the United States to carry identification certificates. PaperSon is identity documents of false relation to blood relatives who have already received their US citizenship. Pretty much just false documents that said that they were related to someone in the United States. I guess gender who attempted PaperSon were Chinese males when it first started. And then in the 20th century, women and children started using PaperSon. The way that Chinese immigrants were caught for being illegal, the United States had these oral tests that would pretty much ask the Chinese immigrants questions based on their documents. And these documents weren't little, they were like very detailed documents. They had family history and like village life in them. So these questions had to be answered right. If they weren't answered right, they were found, Chinese immigrants were found illegal. And what would happen is that they would be deported back to China. For the last question, when did that era end? There wasn't a specific date as to when it ended, but it started in the late 19th century after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then until the 1960s, the mid 20th century, because in the 1960s, that's when immigration restrictions started to decrease. PaperSon became very popular and it increased the Chinese population. Are two historical events that really allowed PaperSon to be popular. So like we learned earlier in the semester, in 1870, thousands of Chinese laborers had established Chinatown, which was their own space. We learned that their presence also wasn't welcome, but it was nice for them to have their own space. And then in 1906, there was the San Francisco earthquake. It really caused a negative and also positive effect, and I'll explain. So the earthquake destroyed a lot of the Bay Area of California, which included Chinatown. And this led to a lot of complications for the Chinese. Not only were they not welcomed, but now like white Americans saw this as an opportunity to push the Chinese out. And a lot of Chinese ended up moving to Southern California. So there was only now a couple hundred living in San Francisco. The positive to this earthquake was that documents and reports were destroyed on Chinese immigrants. So a lot of the Chinese that stayed in San Francisco claimed native birth, which under the 14th Amendment allowed them legal citizenship. So these two images on this slide just show the earthquake. Like the first one shows like the overview map. The red area, it's very small, but that's California, that's San Francisco, my bad. And so it messed a lot of the coast in the Bay Area. And then the bottom image shows like the destruction, like even on the right side, you can see that the buildings are destroyed, windows, debris, a lot of smoke. That was just a small piece of San Francisco after the earthquake. Another major event that made Paper Sun popular was the Chinese Revolution of 1949. So with war, as we know, it causes a lot of fear, and a lot of Chinese were fearful living in China. So a lot of them came to the United States, not only because of war, but also for a new life, new opportunity. So they came to the United States through Paper Sun, which was beneficial at the time up until 1955, when the American Council in Hong Kong warned the United States about false citizenship, which was Paper Sun. That caused a huge investigation over the Chinese population living in the US. Whether you were legal or illegal, you were investigated on to see if you were using Paper Sun. This ended up causing a lot of the Chinese to be deported back to China. It also, I found out, caused a lot of suicides. A lot of Chinese immigrants ended up dying because they would rather die than go back to China. And for this, my last slide, I wanted to tie in how Paper Sun goes into with what we were talking about, second generation. So I found a story on a Chinese immigrant. His name was Jim Fong Gok. He was a Chinese immigrant that traveled to the United States as a Paper Sun. He was considered first generation. In the 1920s, he was traveling. He was 17 years old at the time, and his documents that his parents had bought for him were labeled as the Fong family, so his name was changed to Jim Fong. It was no longer Jim Gok. When he got to the United States, he assimilated to American culture, started to because not only was his name changed, he found a job, he got married. He also had children, 3 children, and those children were second generation because they were born in the United States. So they were automatically legal citizens under the 14th Amendment.
What is the significance of Paper Suns as it relates to Asian American history?
I think that it kind of shows the innovation and determination of Chinese Americans to not let their population just, age and kind of go away, they wanted to be Americans and they wanted to establish a presence and a community in the United States. And even though they had legal restrictions against them, they still continued to find ways to persist. And I think that Paper Suns is just a really big part of that.
So it demonstrates, I guess, resilience or persistence of the Chinese American communities in some ways. Yeah, I find it really interesting because of all the ethnic groups, Chinese American communities were one of the few communities that could not really blossom because of the anti-miscegenation law, because of the Page Law, things like that, right? Where they could not form families, have children. The second generation Chinese Americans were very few in number, right? There were legal restrictions, there were structural impediments that made it really difficult for the Chinese American communities to really expand, right? But this unfortunate event turned into an opportunity. The unfortunate event being the earthquake became an opportunity for the Chinese Americans to take advantage of a loophole that was created as a consequence of all these legal documents, including birth certificates, naturalization papers being burned. Well, let me ask you, how did, these paper sons, what was the process involved in getting these paper sons from China to come to the United States? How do you think they came? What do you think the process was? Right? Somebody must have petitioned these children to come to the United States, those Chinese who were living in the United States. So there were brokers who were probably recruiting people back in China to come to the United States, people of certain age group. And they might inform them, hey, would you like to go to the United States as a citizens, right? And we could match you up with someone in the United States who can claim you as their son. These brokers were then able to identify, a number of potential paper sons. And then what happens? They get on the boat, and where do you think they would land?
In Angel Island.
On Angel Island, traverse across the Pacific Ocean, and they would dock in this immigration station on Angel Island. They would not actually move into San Francisco yet. They would land on this Angel Island, on which there existed stations or buildings where many of these potential paper sons were initially housed. And then what happened? Were they automatically able to enter the United States? They had to actually prove that they were sons of these petitioners.
I was just gonna say that like the book this week was saying like 10% of all of the like Chinese immigrants around that time were like sent back because they weren't believed. They were asked like super random questions like, did you have a dog? Did you have a clock in your house?
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
So they were, in fact, they were detained on Angel Island before they were able to verify sons of these petitioners. And how were they able to ascertain whether or not these sons were, exactly who they say they were? And the immigration officers would ask all kinds of questions about the relationship between the sons and the parents. The petitioners, it's interesting to kind of think about how they were able to claim that they had sons back in China, right? Because these sons were coming from China, and the petitioners are in the United States. Yeah, they're submitting these petitions to the US government saying that, hey, you know what? I had visited China some time ago, and during my visit, I was fortunate enough to have children. I fell in love with this woman, and I was able to have babies there. And under the US law, if one of your parents is an American citizen, even though you were born in China, you could claim American citizenship. And that's how they were able to say, you know what? My sons who were born in China, they're American citizens. And at that time, most of the Chinese in America could not become American citizens. And yet they could claim American citizenship because in San Francisco's earthquake, they lost all of the important documents, such as the birth certificate. They claimed that they were born in the United States, therefore they were American citizens. As American citizens traveling to China and having children, they're American citizens too. And these children would end up on Angel Island, and the immigration officers would ask all kinds of random questions. So prove to us that you are in fact who you say you are. There are some questions that I wanted to share with you that immigration officers at that time would ask. So this was published in New York Times. So these were, some of the questions that they would ask, right, about the alleged relationship between the son and the father, right? And they would ask questions like, how many houses are there in Hin Village? And then the answer given was just 4 houses on 4 rows. Where is the applicant's house located in that village? Applicant here refers to the father. First house from the west. And what was the applicant's house made of at the time you visited Hin Village in 1929? It was built of burnt brick. Do you know the difference between burnt brick and any of the other materials they build houses out of in China? Yes. What other materials are there? Most of them are built of burnt brick. Some are built of concrete. Were there any houses in Him Village built of concrete? Not that I can remember, right? So these are really detailed questions, right? Do you know how many rooms are in the applicant's house in Him Village? There are 5 rooms, center room, 2 bedrooms, and 2 kitchens. A very interesting list of questions that sought to ascertain alleged relationship between the father and the son. This is a photo of a paper son being questioned by immigration officer on Angel Island. I came across a very interesting New York Times article that talked about the phenomenon of paper son. And I wanted to just share with you an excerpt from this article, right? This article was published on July 19th, 2009. The paper son system was devised after the exclusionary law passed in 1882. To be a paper son was something you didn't advertise. A lot of times your own children might not have known the story. There are folks half generation older than me who tell me that, yeah, I'm a Chen, but I'm actually a Wong. And they know this once their fathers reveal that was the family history. What's interesting was that there was what was known as a Chi sort of book that was discovered in one of the opium dens in New York. And this was a 50-page notebook that is made of the coarse sheets bound with string, 8 of them filled. And according to translators hired by the New York Times, it contains 53 questions and answers about Mr. Chang's lineage and life in Go Lo Hao village in the Huiping district in southern China. Among the questions, how many siblings, etc., right? And Mr. Chang's notebook was found in 1941 at an opium den in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, after he had been arrested in New York for drug possession. It was turned over to the federal immigration authorities. It is unclear what happened to Mr. Chang, right? So it's fascinating. They had apparently coached each other about sibling situations, about the houses, about the communities, the villages that they lived in, right? And they had written all of these things down because they knew that these specific questions were going to be asked once they arrive at the immigration detention center on Angel Island, right? And so they would memorize all these questions and answers, right? And it was interesting how some of these rare documents were discovered long after. And unfortunately, this particular one was discovered in an opium den in New Jersey, which is, I think speaks volumes about the China's history with British colonization, the Opium Wars, etc., leading to, again, immigration of the Chinese in the United States, the exclusion, and finally, through the paper sons phenomenon, allowing some of the Chinese children to come to the United States with fake IDs. They had to change their last names, etc. Can you imagine? So they were leaving their birth parents behind in order to come to the United States to join with these petitioners who were not related at all, which I find it really fascinating. It wasn't until 1943 when the United States would allow Chinese to immigrate into the United States again, because it was during the height of World War II, right? If you remember. And at that time, China had joined the Allied forces. China was fighting on the same side as the United States. And in appreciation for their participation in the war, on the side of the United States, the US government passes a law known as the Magnuson Act of 1943. For the first time, the Chinese immigrants would be allowed to enter the United States. There were war brides who were able to come to the United States under this act as well. And again, in 1965, we would pass the Immigration and Naturalization Act that would open up immigration and naturalization for the rest of the populations. But something else really interesting happened between 1943 and 1965 as well, because Anissa mentioned, in 1949, China becomes red. China becomes communist, right? So Mao Zedong, who becomes the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, he would lead this revolution in China. And a lot of the people who were against, in opposition to communism, would flee to an island. There were tens of thousands of people who opposed China becoming communist, and they fled China, right? And they went to this island, Taiwan. There was a general by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. He was a general during World War II who was intensely opposed to Chinese communism, and tens of thousands of people fled to present-day Taiwan. But China still claims Taiwan is part of their jurisdiction, right? And which has become a source of major international sort of conflict, right? Because the U.S. sometimes, supports Taiwan, but has to constantly be mindful of how China might react. Interesting things happen in the 1950s. So when China became red, the Chinese living in the United States came under intense scrutiny by the US government. And this was in the 1950s during the rise of the McCarthyism. Senator McCarthy was the one who led intense investigations within the United States against those people who sympathize with communism, those people who joined any of the communist parties or organizations or memberships. And the Chinese living in the United States were automatically suspected of sympathizing with communist China, right? And so they were like interrogations. FBI would knock on their doors and interrogate them as to whether or not that they supported China's communism, right? So, just crazy stuff happened in the 1940s, 1950s, and beyond, right? But the paper sense phenomenon, I think, speaks volumes about not only their resilience and persistence, right? But it was really the first opportunity for Chinese living in the United States to actually raise children who can now claim American citizenship status because of the birthright citizenship. I find it really fascinating that a lot of the turns and twists in American history would significantly impact the future course of many of these community members. I wanted to share screen one more time and talk a little bit about the Japanese American second generation. The Japanese American communities, those who were unlike the Chinese Americans, there were thousands of second generation Japanese Americans at the turn of the 20th century. And they sought to do their best to assimilate into American society. And I wanted to share with you some of the ways in which they sought to do that. One was through religious sort of venues, right? Many of them had joined churches, even though their first generation, immigrant generation of the Japanese communities were not Christians, but by the second generation, they were willing to become more American by going to churches, right? The Gospel Society, for instance, was first founded in San Francisco in 1877. They offered English classes, not Japanese classes, but they offered English classes, and they provided homes or boarding and a place for people to meet. Very similar to other sort of religious sanctuaries that provide a lot of other services beyond just worship, right? For Japanese Americans to become Christians was a sign that they were willing to assimilate into American society. Japan Society was a sort of mutual aid social service organization that helped a lot of the Japanese Americans, second generation in particular, who were required to serve in the military because of the draft laws. They assisted many of the Japanese Americans regarding these issues. They provided legal aid support, particularly when in 1913, California and other sort of neighboring states had passed the Alien Land Law. So, as a social service legal aid organization, they provided very important legal service to the communities as well. Here is a newspaper article that discusses how Japanese Americans during this time period, who were not necessarily welcomed by the community members, nonetheless participated very importantly during the 4th of July parade, right? And the editor of this newspaper article writes, "Seems strange, does it not, that it remained for the Japanese, whom we are endeavoring to get stopped from coming here or owning lands in our midst, to put on such a fine patriotic float as the birth of the flag in the parade on our 4th of July celebration. It was a very fine effort and showed much artistry." It's important to also recognize that Japanese Americans had created what would become one of the most important community organizations known as the Japanese American Citizens League. And JACL would play a very important role, particularly during the internment era. And there were various Japanese civic and political organizations had formed earlier. For instance, in 1928, New American Citizens League, right? So once again, the emphasis is on American citizen, right? These are organizations that were formed by the second generation American-born Japanese Americans. And these leagues were found in various chapters in San Francisco, Fresno, Seattle, San Jose, Salinas, and Monterey, where there was a critical mass of Japanese Americans living in those communities. JACL was formed 6 years later in 1934, and they provided very important social and political functions. From 1934 to 41, designated floats with patriotic themes, George Washington Declaration of Independence, and Matthew Perry's opening of Japan. While this might be perceived as a sort of American incursion into Japan, the second generation Japanese Americans did not necessarily see this as an act of imperialism on the part of the United States. Some of the key characteristics of JACL include the following. They are almost entirely composed of Nisei, which means second generation. Ni means two or second. Sei means generation. Professionals and small businessmen. And their purpose was to disseminate information about the educational and business achievements of the Japanese American community. They wanted to propagate to the rest of the communities, non-Japanese American communities, that they are doing their best to assimilate into American society through educational and business opportunities. And their strategy was rather conservative and accommodationist in that they only spoke English. They adopted American cultural customs and values and denounced dual citizenship. So they wanted to distance themselves from their ethnic sort of first generation parents and really wanted to assimilate as Americans who were born on American soil. And their common sort of objective or theme was to struggle for inclusion as Americans. But I wanted to share with you how the emergence of the second generation among the various Asian Americans really was a departure from the first generation. And their motivation, their worldviews were very different than the first generation immigrant parents. And having been born on American soil, educated in the United States, spoke English, this was their land. This is their home. And it's very important for us to remember that, because I think the racial logic is that, it doesn't matter whether you were born here or if you came to the United States as an adult, you're still, Japanese, right? That sense of you being perceived as a foreigner, even though you were born on American soil, would have deleterious impact on not only Japanese Americans, as we will discuss regarding the internment experience, but also other Asian Americans as well. We continue to struggle, I think, with the popular perception that American-born Asian Americans are still foreigners.